So what processes do you have to have in place to get this high quality data, accurate and consistently coded data? Manual methods certainly work, but they do take a lot of time and effort, which means a lot of high costs. So simple brute force in terms of just, checking and rechecking your data entry can work, but it's maybe not the best option, especially if the client's doing the work. It's not something they probably enjoy, so you might be upsetting them more so than they should be. So of course that would lead people to, well, let's just use tech. And of course, tech isn't the default answer. You should really have fundamentals in place before you move to that. So what we wanted to talk about before tech is actually three things. We've got standardizing your bookkeeping procedures, separating out transactional workflows from technical accounting workflows, as well as one of my more favorite topics, it's more of a passion topic that I've got, owning the bookkeeping process from end to end. So there's three things that we'll kind of talk about before we get to the tech piece. And the first of those is standardizing your bookkeeping procedures. So whether for yourself, your internal team, or your client, standardizing your bookkeeping workflows are a great way to make general processes more efficient and easy. What do we mean by standardizing bookkeeping procedures though? We're talking about literally documenting the steps that take bookkeeping functions from start to completion that everybody can follow and know with 100% confidence how to complete those tasks. So it's a very simple concept. And when we mean functions here, we really mean core bookkeeping functions that don't deviate a lot from client to client. So of course, every client has nuances, but we're talking about overall core concepts, say like expense reports. How does a company collect that expense information? How does it go through a system and actually get into the accounting system itself? If you can standardize that across clients, it will be a lot easier for you to, build your process out. And so how do these standardized processes help? By setting a consistent procedure, the process becomes easier because it produces more consistent results, and it's more simple to improve and review. And it's just easier for the people involved to actually do because they're just doing it time and again. Especially for a client, if they've got a documented procedure they can look at, they just simply follow the steps and they rinse and repeat every single time they need to do it. Bookkeeping is a lot of recurring entries, so the more you can standardize it and simplify it and document it, the better off you are. And once established, you'll find that typically 80% or more of coding can flow through a standardized process with high assurance of quality. And so what that means from your standpoint, the advisor's standpoint, is that the time to actually check each transaction for accuracy, which is a key piece of quality, is greatly reduced. Instead of spending all of that time on actually checking the data, you can focus on the 10 or 20% of the transactions that are actually different. For your clients as well, it means a lot of their time is reduced as well for accuracy checks. They just simply do the tasks, carry them out, and rinse and repeat every single time, and focus more on the process instead of the actual detail. And so one thing to note here is that consistency still might be an issue using manual methods, even if they're standardized, because most people have short-term memories. But of course, this could be standardized as well. So if you think about Home Depot should always be coded to, supplies account, that would be one way to standardize it. So you can still get around it. It's manually involved, but the main point here is the more you standardize it and document it, the better off people are because they know exactly what they need to do. So how do you get started in terms of creating a standardized bookkeeping workflow? If you're directly involved in the bookkeeping process, you likely already have a set way of how you want to do things. And so write this process down as a list of steps or create a flowchart diagram at a very high level. Then simply break it down into more detailed sub-steps in terms of people and the work they need to carry out in order to get that job done. And step back and take a look at that process as a whole and make sure it makes sense. Are there areas that are redundant and could be cut out? Do the sequence of steps make logical sense in terms of how information is actually physically shared and received? Once you start looking at a holistic level, it's really surprising how much can be learned about a process and what can be saved and made more streamlined and efficient once you actually have that holistic view. So as simple as it sounds, writing that procedure down and actually documenting it is a core piece. And of course, once you have that bookkeeping process detailed and documented, sharing it with those people that are involved is really important to get their feedback. Making sure that their roles and duties are clearly explained and that people actually understand what work needs to be done with 100% clarity is super important, because if that's not there, the whole point of a standardized process loses its meaning. If they don't understand what to do, they won't do it, and the efficiencies that you can gain are completely lost. So take that, revise it with the feedback, and that's essentially the starting point for a standardized bookkeeping process. And of course, this is grossly oversimplifying it. There's literally books and seminars that you can read on this that, they'll give you a much more involved process, but that is what you should be doing at a very high level. And the main point is really just to document it, standardize it, and make sure that people know that what they're supposed to be doing on a very consistent basis, so that it gets done and you can tweak the process, not just dual transactions. So if you're directly involved with bookkeeping, that's fine. But if you're not, say you're a tax advisor and you're trying to get more into controllership or CFO services, really you need to take that same approach, but you need to talk to the person that is directly involved or controlling the bookkeeping process and carry out the same type of documentation project with them on a collaborative basis. And so I say a collaborative basis because sometimes people can kind of get their backs up in the air. They've got their set way of doing things. They don't want other people getting involved. I mean, we'll get into this in terms of my owning the process piece, but we're hired as advisors to implement best practices and help people out as much as we possibly can. So, these projects can be done and should be done. Just make sure that we're doing them in a collaborative and cooperative way. So there's a few considerations to have when building out standardized bookkeeping processes. In my experience, client input is always a roadblock. While bookkeeping is important to them and they do need it done, it's really never their top priority. So when you're looking at your process at a very high level, again, as those steps or the flow chart, really look at ways to reducing the client's efforts as much as you possibly can. Ironically, taking the work away from them adds to your value because it's something that they don't like doing. And if it is redundant work, it actually improves the overall bookkeeping function. So you're actually saving them time and improving the process. So the more that you can do that, the better. And where you can't eliminate client input, think about ways that you can invest in training and support. Again, this helps eliminate a bottleneck at the very beginning of a bookkeeping process and just helps the entire process of getting higher quality data end to end. Another thing to consider is keeping your end data requirements as simple as you possibly can. The more complex you want your output to be, the more complex the process has to be. And so maybe seems a little bit simplistic or too general, but it is extremely true. So if you think of job costing as a really good example, if you're doing data entry with job costing, that requires a lot more additional time and thought and effort than does just simple data entry. And so creating a standardized process around there becomes a little more complex and is a little more harder to follow. And of course, the more you do that and the more the companies grow and the activity grows, the more that effort compounds and the harder it is to do. So really think about the end data that you need in terms of producing your forecast and your advisory, and really frame and set the bookkeeping process as a whole around that. So really try to keep it as simple as you possibly can, the whole KISS rule, which I love to ascribe to. So that's kind of the standardized bookkeeping processes, just again, at a very high level. That's kind of just surfacing it very quickly. There's two other things that I talked about at the start though. And the second one was separating transactional workflows from technical accounting workflows. And so what do I mean by that? There's a lot of different routines for bookkeeping, accounting, tax, and the frequency with which all of these are carried out is always different. Cash flow advisory typically ties in best with bookkeeping workflows. And if your coding is accurate and consistent, the best time for cash flow forecast and cash flow advisory is basically right after the bank account is fully reconciled and up to date. And the reason for that is because it greatly reduces the risk of double counting, and it really reduces the amount of time and effort that you need to spend ensuring that there isn't any double counting. So payroll being a really good example, if you've set it in your forecast for the 15th of every month and the 30th, the end of the month, but maybe it comes out a few days earlier, those are the kind of the nuances that you have to watch for in terms of cash flow advisory. So if the bank rec is properly done up front, you don't need to worry about that and spend any time thinking about it. It just simply is done. And so when it comes to transactional or bookkeeping workflows and technical accounting workflows, this is problematic more when you've got someone doing end-to-end, so bookkeeping plus for financial reporting, and the processes are tied together. And the problem really arises when you need cash flow advice that is required on a more frequent basis. So a really good example would be is you have a client that wants to do monthly cash flow forecasting services, and you do the bookkeeping and financial statements for that client quarterly or maybe even annually. And so one way to combat that is you could spend more time on the forecast itself and making sure that there aren't any of these redundancies or double counting, or you could look at decoupling the actual bookkeeping workflows from the period end workflows and making those reconciliations and the actual transactional workflows more consistent. And so the reason that you might want to consider that is because typically those bookkeeping workflows are pretty easy to change, especially if the client's doing them, they just simply do them more frequently. And the way to separate them is really simple. You just, anything transactional data related, anything related to the bookkeeping process, so source document collection, bank reconciliations, client follow-ups, those can be set to say the monthly basis using our example. And then you do your forecast right after them without fear of duplicate transactions or inaccuracies. And then you can still do all of your quarter end or annual financial statements as you have in the past. Those don't need to change at all. The main point here is that you can separate those two, and you shouldn't be afraid to, because the amount of time that you can save in your forecast could actually be more than made up in terms of the slight additional effort it would take to do the actual bookkeeping workflows. The third piece I was talking about was owning the bookkeeping process. So I talk about this a lot with professionals, probably more so when I'm a little more off the cuff. And it is more of a passion thing for me. You know, we're hired as experts and we're here to implement best practices. But I often find, even myself, we often make compromises with clients in order to make them happy. And this is completely fine as long as it doesn't impede with our work. If we can't do our work properly, we'll never be able to provide the client with what they want. And we're kind of setting ourselves up for failure as well as the client for failure, because, you know, they've hired us for a specific purpose. So when it comes to the bookkeeping process, we really need to make sure that we own it. And I don't mean lording over staff members or the clients and micromanaging the entire process from end to end. What I'm really talking about here is being in tune with how the bookkeeping process works for that client and that company, and the steps that are required to carry it out properly, and really ensuring that it produces the information that we need as an advisor. And if it doesn't, then improving it so that it does. So really being, providing feedback and improvements so that we get the data and the quality that we need. So owning the process is particularly important when clients are doing their own established in-house bookkeeping processes. And sometimes we essentially get scared to suggest new methods. And it's a good thing to remember that we were actually hired to do just that. We were hired to implement some best practices. So even if it doesn't relate specifically to the forecast itself, the foundation level, the bookkeeping work that needs to be done is part of that process. So don't be afraid to make suggestions in that regard. So we've talked about standardizing bookkeeping processes, separating bookkeeping and accounting workflows, and owning the process. And so that gives us high quality data. If we can do that well and we can do it consistently, we'll have high quality data. So data that's accurately coded and consistently coded. Key piece though is trying to get timely financial data. And so standardizing the process helps you get more timely data. But again, as we mentioned too and alluded to, manual efforts can only go so far. So it does take a lot of work to get that high quality data. And that is where you can turn to technology. And of course, having more up-to-date records is really important, because the more we can have information in real time and on hand, the better we can provide those we can provide the advice to our clients on a real-time and ongoing basis.